Hi, my name is Tessa and I'm a beginner costume designer. This is the final video for my recently completed Attolia costume. In this video, I'll be talking about the inspiration behind this dress here, as well as sharing some photos and some of the design choices I made along the way. If you'd like to see a written description of this, there will be a link to my portfolio and specifically the page on this costume in the description of this video. If you'd like to see a more in-depth version of the entire process of making this costume, there will also be a link to a playlist which will have all of the YouTube videos that I've posted that have any mention of this costume in it. The main inspiration for this costume comes from this book, The Thief by Megan Whalen Turner. It's the first in a series of 6 books called The Queen's Thief. It also has some of the most vivid descriptions of the specific dress that I was trying to go for. Without giving away too much of the plot and story, this dress is a very specific symbolic dress to one of the main characters, Attolia. In this book, she is described like so. Her hair was black and held away from her face by an imitation of the woven gold band of Hephaestia. Her robe was draped like a peplos, made from embroidered red velvet. That's a really great starting point for the costume. It gave me a lot to work on in terms of the shape of the dress, the fabric, the details, and so I immediately started working on it just based off of that. I really didn't need much more information. Now, you probably can't see on that camera, and so I'll give you a little bit of a close-up view. But the fabric that I used on this dress is not actually velvet as described in the books. Instead, it's something called shot silk. Shot silk basically means that there's one color of thread that's on the weft and one that's on the warp, which in this case is black and red. And what that means is that depending on the way the light hits the fabric, it will look different. So in the shadows, this fabric is very dark because that's where the black is getting the most of the attention, whereas on the outer folds and ridges of the dress, it will be more red. It gives kind of the same color effect as velvet, but without any of the weight. And velvet is also very warm. I've done now 2 costumes in a row working with velvet, and for one thing, I really didn't want to work with velvet anymore. And considering that this takes place in Greece, or not actual Greece, but clearly inspired by that area of the world, I just didn't think velvet made much sense. Now, that's not critiquing the design itself. I think a peplos out of velvet could be really interesting, but I wanted to go for something a little more historical, so instead I went with this, and I think it came out really well, and it was a lot easier to work with than velvet, which is a huge plus for me. Next in the design process was the shape of the dress. Now, the description says that it's a peplos, but we know based on hints that this story probably takes place closer to Byzantine-ish, if we want to make a parallel between our world and that world, because they aren't the same. It's very inspired by it, but that's about where we think it is. Now, I very deliberately didn't include any elements of Byzantine fashion in this dress because it is definitely a symbol for the character, and I'll talk about that a little bit later because it has some spoilers, so if you don't want to see that, I will warn you ahead of time. Now, this dress is definitely inspired by peplos. It is not in any way historically accurate, but on the screen you can see a couple of the different statues that I used as inspiration, which you can see have the same kind of tunic with a belt and then a long skirt. I liked that style because it gave me a bunch of layers to work with and places to put detail, and especially considering that this was described as having embroidery, I wanted lots of different places where I could add that while making it look natural within the design. On the screen here, you can see the 3 different versions of the embroidery design that I did on this dress. The smallest is at the waist, the one in the middle is on the tunic, and the largest is on the hem of the skirt. Each design has a small gold bead in the middle, and the top 2 are done with satin stitch on the larger areas, while the bottom at the skirt is done with applique with a gold satin fabric that matched the gold thread that I had, because that looked much better than trying to satin stitch such a large area. The design itself is based on the Prince of the Lilies fresco, which is a piece of Minoan artwork. I found it while looking for ancient Greek pieces of art that were about lilies. Lilies, later in the series, are described as being the symbol of the country that this character rules over. And because this dress is such a symbol of power for her, I really wanted to draw inspiration on the country itself. In the book, she's already described as calling back to one of the old goddesses, when it says, "Everything about her brought to mind the old religion, and I knew that the resemblance was deliberate, to remind her subjects that as Hephaestia ruled uncontested among the gods, this woman ruled Attolia." So she's already calling to mind the religion that used to exist in her country, and now kind of still exists. Mostly it exists in one of the neighboring countries, but the influence is still there. And I thought it could be interesting if she also called in some nationalism, for lack of a better word, using the symbols that represent her country in her dress to really make her a figure of power, not just in the ancient religion respect, but also as a symbol of her country. So that's why I decided to go with this embroidery design. Some of the last pieces of the costume are the accessories, more specifically the jewelry. You can see some video of all of the different pieces of jewelry that I used on the screen right now. There were 2 pieces that were really important. Her crown, which is inspired by Hephaestia, the goddess that she's trying to call back to, and the earrings, which are a bit of a spoiler, so I won't talk about them too much, but they are important to the character. After I got those 2, the rest of the jewelry was really free to play around with as I liked. One of the things that she talks about in the book as this character is that she had to sell off a lot of her jewelry to kind of buy loyalty from her nobles, and she slowly gets it back. And I think for her, that's one of the few ways that she expresses wealth. A lot of rulers throughout history have expressed a lot of their country's wealth through their clothing. Now, Attolia can't do that because she's trying to represent her power through this symbol that is her dress that she wears on a regular basis while ruling in the first few books of the series. But she does get to have a little bit more fun with her jewelry. So I did lots of different things. I had different interesting bracelets that I used. I had an upper arm cuff that I used. I made a red, not quite choker, but shorter necklace. The second necklace is one that I bought and is supposedly based on, I believe, a Minoan piece of jewelry, and it's in the shape of a bee. I liked the fact that it called back the original reference that I had for the embroidery, and it also just worked well with the shapes within the embroidery. It also kind of references a pair of earrings that we read about in one of the books, I believe the second in this series, that is a pair of bumblebee earrings. The last piece of this costume that I really spent some time thinking about was the skirt. Now, I am not a historical recreation costumer. I don't go for perfect accuracy. I don't even research even close to enough for historical accuracy, never mind the fabrics that I use. But from my limited research and knowledge, a real peplos would have something more of a rectangle skirt, which is not what I went for with this. For this dress, I ended up going for a circle skirt. This is because there's a specific scene in a different book, I believe it's either the second or third book, that has Attolia in a different dress, though still red, where she's spinning and the skirt flares out around her. And it's a very striking scene, and even though I knew I didn't want to make that second dress for her, I did kind of want to have some element of that because it is just this beautiful scene where you read it and you immediately recognize, what it is, and you can really easily picture it, or at least that's what it was for me. So I did want to make a reference to that. So I did make a circle skirt, and you can see here on the screen that this skirt does spin quite nicely. Not quite as nicely as I would have liked. I think the weight of the embroidery kind of keeps it down, as well as the grain of the fabric. I think something just didn't work quite right there, so it doesn't do the full flare out that I was hoping for. It's also a full length skirt, so it is quite heavy. But it does spin out, and I'm very happy with the way that turned out. Thank you so much for watching. I really enjoyed making this costume, and I hope you enjoyed watching this video. If you want to see more of the work that I have done and keep up with the work that I will do in the future, my portfolio and Tumblr are linked in the description of this video. And I also post bi-weekly costume updates on this YouTube channel. If there's anything you'd like to see about this costume or any of the costumes that I've done, please feel free to let me know.